Hello everybody, I can already see we've got a number of participants jumping onto today's webinar. Obviously such a significant and an incredible topic for us to be presenting on. What we'll do as per usual is just allow a few moments for the large number of registrants to jump on, which would be absolutely fantastic. And then I'll do an official welcome. As per usual, we'll be using both the Q&A and the chat box today. Please feel free to start utilising the chat box. Let us know where across Australia and perhaps further afield that you might be dialing in from. It's always so wonderful to see where everybody is. You can probably see behind me, I'm still working from home, but sitting here in Melbourne, we're very, very excited that I think 2021 is going to be a very different year for us, and absolutely delighted to have our two panelists with us today. So for those who don't know me or haven't been introduced previously, I'm Jo Skipper. I'm the Director of the Next Step Victorian Practice and also the Group Manager of our Build Capability Division. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome today's two panellists from Relationships Australia. Elisabeth Shaw, the CEO of Relationships Australia New South Wales, as well as board member of Relationships Australia National Board, and Rebecca Doyle, the EGM People, Culture and Learning, to support this important conversation and ultimately an action learning session regarding domestic violence. This week also has White Ribbon Day on 20th of November. The purpose of White Ribbon is to bring people together, to raise awareness and commit to action. So once again, hence why we're really delighted to be presenting today. Many of you may have read the recent survey White Ribbon conducted that alarmingly showed that 4 in 10 young men don't consider punching or hitting as domestic violence. All too often, however, we only think of domestic violence as physical violence perpetrated by men. We're going to be educated by Elisabeth and Beck today, who will guide us through the conversation to gain real clarity around the different types of domestic violence, but also what our roles as individuals, as HR and HSE practitioners, leaders and work colleagues and friends can do to support victims of domestic violence. We're seeking to make today as interactive as possible, so please use the chat box and Q&A. We will be running a full Q&A at the end of the session, but there are different sections of the presentation, and we will revert back to the chat box. So if there's something really burning that is pertinent to that particular section, please feel free to use the chat box, and we will be seeking to respond to your questions. So thank you, Rebecca, Elisabeth, welcome to today's session.
Thanks very much, Jo. I just wanted to start our presentation by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we all meet today. I'm in Macquarie Park, so I'm on Darug Nation, and I wanted to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also to thank everyone for joining Elisabeth and I today. And I'll hand over, I'll start off with our first slide. I'll hand over to Elisabeth, and she's going to talk a little bit about RA and what we do, and then we'll jump into the content.
Thanks, Beck, and I'm on Gadigal land today and of the Eora Nation, and I also pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present in this forum. So we're really delighted to be invited to be involved, and such an important area of discussion in organisational life at the moment, and yet a very sort of in some ways private matter. It's both a private matter, people experience it as a private matter and try and keep it private, but as we know, it's a very public social matter and in fact a public health concern. So I think we're working with all sorts of layers So I just wanted to tell you a bit about Relationships Australia for those who don't know us. We're in a federated network, so there's one of us in every state and territory. So Beck and I are from the New South Wales organisation, and so we all run separately, but we're in a national collaboration, and we do work together. And so the organisation was started after the Second World War to assist returning servicemen settle back into family life. And so we've been around for over 70 years, and we're known in a lot of ways for our family law focused work, because we have grown in relation to changes in the Family Law Act, in particular 1975 and no fault divorce, that we, along with a number of other religious organisations, we're not a religious organisation, we were funded in effect to kind of prevent divorce. So a lot of people say, oh, I've heard of you, people I know have been there for marriage counselling. Well, we changed our name from Marriage Guidance to Relationships Australia to signal that it's not all about marriage, but we do have a lovely strong brand in terms of our couple work. But just to let you know, therefore, we continue to do a lot of work in the family law space for people who are mediating around parenting and property agreements on separation. We run children's contact centres for people who are not able to safely have access visits with their kids. So those are, many of our core programs, but we also have a very big relationship education program for parents who are looking for tips and strategies, people who are looking at where to after separation. We're running a new series on resilience given eco-anxiety. We run a lot of schools-based programs. We have a set of trauma-informed services that are focused on forgotten Australians and stolen generation. And we also have youth programs for people leaving care, for adolescents, and also for people leaving foster care. So, and that's just really the tip of the iceberg. That's a bit of what we do in New South Wales, and in every other state they bring their own flavour to it. So just to let you know that as a resource, a referral point for you, there's probably something we do that could help you. But today we're here to talk about family and domestic violence services in particular, and bring that expertise to the conversation. So in New South Wales, we'd have the broadest set of services in the state. So we run men's behaviour change programs for those who are trying to change their violent behaviour. We certainly have programs for women and children leaving violence. We've had a particular program that was about adapting those bodies of knowledge for LGBTIQ communities. We have some new work that we're doing to prevent elder abuse. And we also have a Safer Pathways program, which I'll tell you about in a little bit, but it's for male victims of violence. So, so across the board, we look at violence from a very broad perspective, understanding that there are many perpetrators and many victims, although we do know that this is a gendered issue, and the reality is that that the majority of people causing what we call domestic and family violence will be adult men, but not solely, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'll hand over to Beck.
Great, thanks, Elisabeth. So just thinking a little bit around what are the reasonable provisions as an employer that I'm sure many of you have in place at the moment, but definitely family and domestic violence leave. So whether that's, initially organisations were providing around 5 days of that. A lot of organisations have moved to 10 days, and really we'll talk a little bit further about this, but how do we make sure that people can access this easily? It's great to have it in place, but really important to have people feel comfortable in accessing it. An employee assistance program is often quite invaluable if you do have an employee who's the victim of violence, and really important that you can access that support quickly, whether that's initially over the phone and then maybe either video conferencing or face-to-face support. But that's a really pivotal point, which I'm sure the majority of people on this call will have that in place, but just making sure that the access to that is important. Another thing to think about is whether or not you can provide access to emergency funds. So whether that's to help someone with renting a new location for themselves or for them and their dependents to live in, and making sure that that's something that is easy and can occur quickly, so that once they've decided to potentially leave that environment, they can do that without that financial burden which might be keeping them there. And then, of course, especially safety provisions. So what have you got in place around making sure that when employees come to work, they're safe? So whether that's in relation to making sure that there's privacy. One example might be if someone requests being able to change their email address because they're being harassed online by a partner or an ex-partner. Being able to do that with speed is really helpful, but also some of those logistics around, is it safe for them to get to and from their car or to public transport? All of those sorts of things need to be taken into consideration. And that's got some complexity now that we're all working in either at home or in the office or a model of both. The next thing that we wanted to talk about is just a little bit around the fact that there is, as Elisabeth talked about, this shame or that it's a private matter, and there is often shame in accessing leave. And you can have some amazing policies in place and programs that can really support people, but if they're not accessing that, then we need to unpack why that's happening and think a little bit around how do we make it an environment where people feel comfortable in being able to do that. And I think part of that is around that fear of workplace judgment that they've accessed the leave. And so how do we make sure that we can do that in a way that enables them to happily, or not happily, but to confidently talk to someone, whether it's a manager, a member of the HR or safety team. And we also, there's that tension around the need to work for money, and sometimes work can feel safer than home. I think the other thing is that there's sometimes in our more rural or regional communities or in specialised roles, employment options can be quite limited. So people can often feel like they have to keep working because they're not sure that they'll get work somewhere else. And that can then manifest into them not taking leave when they probably need to. There's also something I wanted to sort of raise, which is the types of leadership can really be triggering for employees. So, you know, there are some traits around family and domestic violence, about unpredictability, about micromanagement of a person's personal life, and that the people using violence against that person, that they're really autocratic in the way that they're trying to limit the choices that that person has. If you overlay those types of behaviours to a work environment, then I think you could see that a work environment could start to look like the similar experience that a person is having at home. And if that's occurring, then their ability to, or their confidence to access leave, access support can be diminished. We know that good leadership helps our teams to thrive and to be successful, but it also enables people to access the support that they might want to. So if they're seeing similar traits in the workplace to what they're experiencing at home, that can really diminish someone's confidence in being able to access that support. And I'm going to hand over to Elisabeth to talk a little bit more now about what family and domestic violence is.
So again, many of you might be very familiar with this and may feel that you have a good grasp of domestic violence. So I don't want to linger unnecessarily, but nor do I want to assume that we can picture the many and varied forms in which violence and abuse can occur. Many of you might have seen the current social discussion on introducing coercive control legislation. And what that's about really is the insidious context in which more obvious examples of violence might occur So, for example, it may be that, and I've as a clinician myself, I've seen many people who, when I've asked if there's ever been a physical assault, a client might say to me, oh, not since we were first together 20 years ago. And you could say, well, okay, so that's in the past then, that's good, isn't it? But in fact, what we know about things like coercive control, and you'll see that there's a segment here of the pie on coercion and threats, that it may be that that one assault 20 years ago actually is calibrated throughout the relationship, so that in fact the victim of the violence knows that at a certain threshold that could be the outcome and never lets it get to that part. Usually it's the victim who starts to modulate their behaviour, and so what it could be is that there was one physical assault, but forever after, the victim is leading a more submissive life, managing emotional intensity in the family, not speaking up in any way, losing voice, losing confidence. So it's an example of where you can't always do an assessment around physical assault. I've also spoken to many women over time, and you know, to my shame, it took me a little while in my career to realise that when I was asking about physical assaults, women weren't telling me about sexual assault because they put it in a different category. Even though we could say it's physical assault, what I know as a clinician is that some of these things, particularly areas of greater shame, or in fact, sometimes in their own minds, they're putting a sexual assault into a category of sexual preference rather than it's part of the package. A recent example that I was looking at that was written up was where, again, a coercive control example, where a male partner on the honeymoon strangled his new wife for the first time with a towel in the bathroom, and never did that again. But when angry about something, would just go and get a towel from the bathroom and just put it somewhere on the dining room table, next to him on the couch, you know, whatever it might be. And it was the signal. So again, it's subtle but palpable. So that's some examples of what we need to know is that physical assault always occurs in a context. It's never apart from anything else. That doesn't mean that in the case of a male using violence that there aren't also examples of equality and support and being a good dad or a good provider. This is not about writing people off or totalising the description, but it is saying that when we hear about things, sometimes even the questions we ask can become a bit sort of limited, and we don't get the full story, because a lot of these other things, I mean, imagine if a female victim came and said to you, oh, my partner keeps turning up with a towel on the table, you know, like how do you describe all the ramifications of that? So usually it's the victim who is alert to some things. And I also know that as I work with this, and sometimes I would give a person in a clinical setting this sort of wheel, and with a highlighter pen just say, what about these different examples? And it's amazing how many more people say, oh, actually, yes, that too, and yes, that too. I wouldn't have said that myself, but if it's all part of the picture. So some of these other things I just want to call out are certainly about using the children, the threats that if you ever left me, I would take the children, I would frame you as crazy, sometimes setting that up. I would say you're an unfit mother. Women who have been victims have at times fought back. Sometimes their fighting back in a physical sense could have been actually self-defense. But it may be that, you know, in the course of a relationship, there will have been ugly fights where perhaps she believes herself to have participated. So again, I've often worked with couples who frame it as mutual violence when in fact it's not at all. But what it can be is then the male who's using violence can use those individual examples to say, oh, well, she's hit me too, or she did this or that, she threatened to take the children or whatever, and it can be framed in quite a mutual way. You'll also note that there can be real segmentation in the relationship. For example, I have worked with couples where there's extreme stereotypical behaviour of different roles to be taken up in the relationship, which are not agreed to but are determined, where women don't have access to money, so therefore can't have a social life of any sort, and also that effect of minimising and crushing confidence, which is again part of coercive control tactics, where a person using violence could minimise the effect they're having. I've had, I not long ago, a man was telling me that he'd given his partner a tap. And when I said, what do you mean by a tap? He said, oh, a headbutt. See, again, that sort of language is very deceptive. And sometimes that's, deliberate minimisation. Sometimes it is, in fact, a lack of understanding the effect one has on another, with cutting comments, ridicule, contempt, those sorts of routine behaviours in a relationship like this, which a female partner may well have, in a sense, got used to and no longer registers that is part of the pattern. Through to things like what we call gaslighting, which is making her feel crazy, playing mind games, that kind of thing. So I think, I'm just trying to paint a picture, because the easiest thing in a way is to talk about, have you ever been hit, or have you been stalked? Those are things that we need to ask about, but we need to remember it's always in a context. I'd also like to just talk to you for a moment about vulnerable cohorts, because we know that the biggest social problem in this space is male violence against women in heterosexual relationships. So, to be really clear, that is a very significant problem. What we often see, though, are the invisible victims, which are the children. And if you know that a staff member has children and has told you about the violence, you might want to inquire about how the children are and how she's travelling as a parent. Women will often say, oh, the children don't know anything about it, they were asleep at the time, or I told them I tripped and fell, or whatever it is. We should remember that children always know. Children know everything. We wish they didn't. But one way or another, they do know. And they are often afraid. I speak to adults who said they were in bed at night with the covers over their head, frightened to come out, wishing that their mother's description of it later was true, but knowing that it wasn't. But there are also children who are witnesses who experience long-term trauma, and that's not for you to pick up necessarily, but I think in your conversations, sometimes just taking into account your employee, but also her family context, because it may be her desire to protect her children, which is keeping her coming to work, or paralysed within an unsafe situation. Older people and elderly people are a concern. Now, again, you might have an employee who's managing relationships with elderly people during COVID, have been very afraid about their older relative. Some will have invited the older relatives to move in with them. And what we know is that older people are at risk, particularly during COVID, because as soon as they're being managed by younger generations, they tend to lose skills and lose confidence. We also know there's a phenomena called inheritance impatience, where older people are bullied by their middle generation to get their inheritance early, and so elderly people are at risk. So it may be that the perpetration of abuse is actually happening between possibly your generation of staff member and those above. And you may have older staff members who, now that more people are staying on past 65, there may be people who are in the category of being afraid to retire because they are preyed upon by their children for their money, and they don't have enough to retire themselves. We know that people with a disability are very vulnerable to sexual assault and violence of various forms. I'm listing parents here, you might be surprised, but we get a lot of calls for assistance from parents who are being physically assaulted by their teenage children. Now, it's not to say this is a widespread phenomena, but I'm saying a service like us gets the calls that exist. And having worked with families where parents are afraid of their 16-year-old who has recently pulled a knife on them, it's no small thing. This is not ordinary family conflict. It can be the case that this follows violence by an adult. Certainly, adolescents are more at risk of becoming violent themselves if they've lived in a violent regime, but you may have parents coming to work who are terrorised in the family in a variety of ways. I want to call out men as victims. We have a Safer Pathways program I mentioned to you. So this is a program funded for the first time in New South Wales. It's, I think it was very interesting for us to look at, what would be the volume of requests. Well, in the last year, we had 24,000 requests for assistance. So this is no small problem. And just to let you know that to put them in categories, about 50% of the men who were in contact about an intimate partner violence. So that might be a gay male partner or a female partner. And the other 50% was other relationships, whether it was their children, flatmates, parents of theirs, a variety of other family forms. Sorry, there's a plane going overhead. Rarely the planes are taking off again now, and they happen to fly over my house. So I think we need to think about, you may have male staff members who are struggling. We know that LGBTQI populations are vulnerable around violence, but in terms of those communities, Aboriginal communities who also are at risk of violence, as called background women, the thing that I would like to say in common, without dismissing their very clear differences, is that when you come from a community that might already be pathologised in social terms or judged, you can have the shame because you want to have pride in your community and you want to be, often part of telling a good story about it. So what it does is it's an extra hurdle to go over to say, not only am I gay, but I'm being beaten up by my partner. That could be just too much to announce. So I think we need to look at vulnerability and stereotypes that we might hold. And to remember that these categories are not distinct. The intersectionality tells us that maybe people with multiple vulnerabilities and multiple reasons not to disclose. So just to call out some of the things in the workplace that you might see, I think it's a real struggle in a workplace setting. You're not clinicians. It's not your job to walk around looking for people needing counselling, and you've got to be careful about privacy because someone might come to work because they're desperate to be upright and functioning, and people who are, there's research on those who are segmenters. I'm a segmenter, and it's about people that go to work and get into work mode and really want to put the outside world to the outside world. You will have all had employees, as I've had, who might have had a terrible death in the family 2 days ago and say, I feel better being at work. I think we've got to respect that. We've got to respect autonomy and we've got to respect privacy. So in putting these things up there, I think it's how we have the conversation, but I want to bring to your attention the kind of things that you might want to consider around whether this is what you're dealing with. And you could see all of these signs for multiple reasons, so please don't take them as a definite diagnosis because that would be unfair. So, clearly people who might have lost confidence in a relationship might present at work equally demoralised, humble, underselling their skills, underselling their abilities, not really feeling they want to put themselves forward for a promotion. And actually they might not be able to tolerate any more stress from more responsibility. They might be nervous. They might be quick to feel judged. They might take things the wrong way because if you say that they're underperforming, that might land on a pile of other statements about inadequacy. They may be very distracted. You may see presenteeism where people are distressed but trying to focus, or presenting as kind of depressed, a lot of the time, melancholic, sort of flatlining, not seeing much joy in things, maybe being compliant more than showing initiative. But equally, you can see people who are suffering in this sort of regime seeming to be very bold outside the house. I mean, I've seen people who are very angry and outraged and quick to see abuses of power and in fact are very fast to name it everywhere else, except maybe to be able to extract themselves from the situation at home. And it can be because they feel safer at work to take on authority. So anger and quick to anger and seeing things in a very sort of limited way, or to call out abuse in the workplace very quickly, could equally be in this constellation of experiences. You may see a change in work performance. It is important to note that in terms of how domestic violence plays out, there are pivotal points in the family where it can get worse. And one of those times is at the point of commitment. So certainly I've spoken to many women who said there had not been anything that they would have called out as abuse until the honeymoon or in the first year. And they might say we were together for X years. And also during pregnancy, it's a very vulnerable time. So the change in work performance could also relate to other changes, developmental changes. It may be that the person is quite isolated in the team and quite deliberately isolated, not wanting to go to social events. Sometimes when, particularly for women who might go out to lunch with other women and talk about their families, you can imagine someone in this situation may not feel they can keep up a happy front, so they'd rather just avoid the staff room or the staff lunch. They may be deteriorating in their attendance, unable to get to work, not in great shape. When they do get at work, you may observe injuries. Unfortunately, there can be injuries that are not visible, like under long sleeve shirts, but there may be injuries. Now, it's true that some people do walk into doors, but unfortunately, a lot of people don't and use that kind of, I mean, it sounds like it's farcical, but I think when people are trying to invent on the spot, I tripped and fell or something happened, you don't want to say what really happened, but you just want to say, I'm sorry that happened, are you okay? And keep an eye out for whether that sort of thing happens again. Someone who is experiencing a lot of sexual assault could be having UTIs and might go to the bathroom a lot. Again, in your role, it's not as if you can bring that up necessarily, but it's about keeping it on your radar and building a picture and seeing if there's an opportunity or a constellation of things that come together. There's also a reluctance to go home, people not wanting to take leave, people wanting to stay back. The first one in the office, the last to leave, you know, in a way that can look like dedicated work time. But, you know, anyone who's struggling to go home, we want to inquire about that. I think we have a question. Are there other things we can look for when people are working from home? I think that some of these same things you could observe on the home front, you know, because people might suddenly have their camera off. There may be something that, you know, is a change behaviour in that sort of way. But I think what we need to do is, first of all, ask some open questions such as, does everybody feel okay working at home? Who would prefer to be back in the office? And start from a nice open question like that. It may be that people who are struggling with violence, sorry, I'm just having some work done in the house, just joined our call, that it may be that anyone who's saying, can I come back to work, just let them come back to work if you're able to come back to work, because you may not need to ask anything more and you might want to respect the person's privacy. But this is where, and I know in our own organisation, we wanted everybody off site. There was no time to think of the nuances of people who are unsafe off site, but now is the time to be letting people back. And a nice open question and see who rushes back could be a really good opportunity to get yourself started in this area. So just as a final call out, and Beck will say more about this, that this tension between wanting to work and being unable to work in a variety of ways is a tension that we need to manage.
Great, thanks, Elisabeth. So we also have lots of opportunities to assist people in building this workplace capacity to deal with violence. And so at Relationships Australia, we offer accidental counsellor training, which I think for many of you in the HR and HSE profession, I know I have said in the past, I'm a HR person, I'm not a counsellor, I'm happy to listen and I'll do my best. But really, for many of us, it's building that capability can really help you develop your job. It doesn't mean that you are a counsellor, and I would recommend that you have trusted sources in which you can refer people to. And I think that's really essential for HR and HSE leaders to know that there's places for them to go with confidence that can do that. So I think that's incredibly important. And there are specialised consultancy services to support HR and safety leaders, whether that's your EAP service, whether that's specific programs that can help your employees, whether it's referring them to a men's behaviour change program if they're a person who's using violence and that's come to light to you, or is it someone who's going through a very difficult separation that may or may not involve violence. Knowing that there are services that you can refer to, I think as a leader in this space is really important, and that you can do that with confidence. I think effective internal process, and Elisabeth talked a bit about this around privacy, is really important. And I think there's a question for all of us to ask, which is it the line manager's responsibility? And is that appropriate, or should an employee want to be able to bring these matters to their HR or HSE team? Or, you know, should we have DFE allies, just like we do LGBTIQ allies? I think we need to think around this with a broader lens and with some innovation around how we can provide that support. But I think, you know, protocols to ensure safety of the employee while they're on site and moving to and from the office is really important. And as I said, those DFE allies, I think, is something that I've been thinking about over the last few months and trying to work out how we do that. And once we do that, I'll be happy to come back to the group and share that. But I think there's something in that idea that's helpful. And the effective management of employees using violence, I think this is a real struggle. It's really hard to know as a leader exactly what you do with an employee that has either disclosed to you or it's come to your attention in whatever way that they're a person who uses violence. There's lots of discussion around the fact that some people say the person should be referred immediately to the police and should be stood down from your employment. We know that financial pressure can add to the situation. And so how do you make sure that there's an opportunity to refer them to the right location to get support? And I think having trusted people that you can do that with, whether it's a service like RA or someone else, is really important. I can just see we've got a question here. Do you recommend mental health first aid training? Look, I have seen mental health first aid training used in another role I was in a few years ago, and it was very successful. It gave people, especially people in my team, confidence around how to deal with some matters. I think if you have the opportunity to do it, it is very helpful. But I also think that thinking around that accidental counsellor for some people as well might help them, especially if traumatic things are disclosed to them, so that they have some self-care as well. I think that's really important. Elisabeth, was there anything you wanted to say on this slide?
So I just wanted to note that having worked with different organisations who've even gone as far as to terminate someone's employment when violence has been disclosed one way or another, either the person's gone to court for a matter and might have had media attention, or it may be that they've spoken up at work. I think we've got to be very careful about that as organisations, and also just to remember that these are people who use violence, rather than start to just call them perpetrators as if that's all that they are. Because in your instance, they're employees, and they're employees who are engaged in behaviour that's not good for them, not good for anybody. And so, of course, you have to protect your reputation and your brands that you're working with. So if someone's in the public domain as using violence, obviously you've got to think that through. But I think we've got to be very careful of examples of scapegoating, and we've all seen these, where we decide that someone is undesirable. We don't like their behaviour and we don't want to be associated with it. So I think what's really important is to first of all say, what do we think of this person as an employee? Are they a valuable employee? Do they want our support? Just like if they had come to work a couple of times drunk or whatever it might be, what do we want to do and what is reasonable support? And I think this is a really hard one with violence, for people using violence, because if you look at the light of day test, which is the classic, if this appeared on the front page of the national paper, how would it look? That our brand has been knowingly employing a person using violence, and we sent them off to a men's behaviour change program. So you might have to, tolerate flack for that, because there is a temptation to say, cut these people loose. But in fact, what that does is it not only writes off a person as the sum total of their behaviour, but it actually could render them more unsafe and unhinged. So I'm not saying keep them at all costs, but what I'm saying is we have to first of all develop the principles around which we make good decisions. Like, what are good ethical decisions to make, and what are the principles by which we make decisions about employees who have a poor home life of various sorts. What are we prepared to tolerate around poor attendance, drug and alcohol use, at-risk behaviours of various sorts, and make sure that we, as those trying to make an organisation run well, that we don't end up scapegoating or rendering unfair decision making in service of some sort of social judgment. So I just would encourage that to bring that out, and to say that anybody who comes forward for assistance because they know, and they might frame it as anger management. So we know that violence is not anger management, but if someone said, I do have trouble with my anger, or it's anger that you're seeing in the workplace, by all means refer to an anger management program. Use whatever frame is the safe frame and the frame to manage the pride and the shame to get the person assistance around anger, then that's a really good start. I think anger is a normal emotion, and so that could be an easier conversation to be having. And it may be, look, I see you're angry at work. Do you find yourself angry outside of work as well? You may not have to go too far, but if the person just says, yes, I do, do people around you find you a bit scary? Yes, they do. Well, then that's as far as you need to go, and you could refer on and leave it to an organisation like us to take it from there. So we've also got to make sure, from what Beck has said, that you have a really good list of organisations to refer to that are running evidence-based programs. You don't necessarily want a whole lot of private practitioners on your list. No disrespect meant. I'm a private practitioner myself as a clinician, but not everybody has done specialised training in working with violence. It's a particular form of treatment. It's not your average counselling. So I would encourage you to look at your referral lists and make sure that at least if you're trying to get them help, you get them evidence-based assistance.
Great. Thanks, Elisabeth. For some reason, this isn't, my slides aren't moving on, so I'm sorry about that. Let me just pop to this one. So we're almost at the end, but what we wanted to talk about was a little bit around what did COVID teach us at RA NSW. So we traditionally delivered all of our services face-to-face. So people would come into our centres, they would see a counsellor. We did some work over the phone, but the majority of it was face-to-face. So what I'd say is exactly that. There was a race to work from home. We knew that the lockdown was coming in New South Wales and it was going to, I know it had an impact for lots of organisations, but we hadn't had an experience of working remotely, especially across the delivery of our service. So we didn't have a very nuanced response. I think I very much put my experience of leading safety teams hat on and said, we're going to go into lockdown and we've told we've got to be at home. And so we did. And we didn't really think through around what if home wasn't particularly safe. And so I think once we did go and get into this mode of getting everyone home, it then became apparent to us that there were some people who really did benefit from actually coming to the office. And so we tried to facilitate that as much as we could. And then we also understood that in that race to return to the office, that everything in that online environment around our service delivery, it didn't always translate. And building that workplace culture and having people connect was also something that was really important for us. And so we think that there's a lot that we've learnt through this process, but I would say it was very much for me an aha moment when I went, oh my goodness, I haven't taken into consideration the fact that some people probably are safer at home than they are in the workplace. And you know, I felt a little foolish when I realised that, having participated in white ribbon accreditations before, worked with Our Watch around violence. And so someone like me who's had experience in this space as a HR practitioner, I forgot about it for a moment as well. So it is easy to occur. We just need to be mindful that home isn't always the safest place. And I suppose that's the thing that I learned or was reminded of around COVID. And I'm just going to hand over to Elisabeth to talk a little bit about gender equality and DFE, and then we'll be open for some additional questions.
Thanks, Beck. I think you've just raised a really important point too, which is another sort of layer of shame, is sometimes for those of us who feel like we should be across things, we can feel worse. So you can imagine if you're an HR professional, and some of you on this seminar will have lived with domestic violence in your life. You may currently be living with it, and yet you might be seen to be more informed than the average person. So, and in my profession, you can imagine that would be the same too. And so I've had colleagues come to me and say, to my very great shame, I'm living with this. You'd think I'd know better. Because what we know is that the victim generally just feels like, well, I'm an idiot for staying. And it's therefore I've made my bed and I better lie in it. And the more you're supposed to be across these issues, the harder it can be to speak up about it. So I think we have to remember, without any judgment, that what you get entangled in psychologically is the same for everybody, and help our colleagues speak up as well. So what we know is that there is clear research that says that that violence does exist in a society where there is patriarchy and gender inequality, that this is going to exacerbate how these things come about, because the pointy end of the role stereotypes gives rise to autocratic systems and hierarchy in the family. And in certain cultures, this is exacerbated more. So I think we have to consider, without moving to limited stereotypes, that there are going to be all sorts of cultural, community, religious, and gendered explanations and understandings of what's at work that enables violence to keep happening. We also know, though, that as Beck spoke about earlier, that organisational systems can replicate some of these power and control mechanisms. And so as HR specialists, to be able to say, well, how can I influence the culture to be healthy? And even if you don't have any victims of abuse coming forward, what you can know is that if you're in an autocratic regime or where decisions are seen to be made unfairly, unjustly, and without a lot of integrity or fairness, then you are in a culture where not only people could feel silence, they're unlikely to disclose anything further. So regardless, this is something that needs to be addressed. And the approach that you're able to lead in human resource management in self offers ambassadorship, and it symbolises the winds of change, or it symbolises something about other types of conversations that are available. So I think it's really important to use the leverage that you can to establish a culture that is safer. So I think don't think that you're not addressing it if you actually address the broader context, which is things like gender inequality and pay gap issues, looking at inclusive practices in terms of who's on your leadership team. There's still a lot of organisations that don't have gender equity, let alone cultural and other disadvantage areas being attended to through inclusive practices. Many organisations are not anywhere near measuring belonging in a workplace. That's something that we've only just started to do, and I feel very passionate about. But we know that boards, AICD, for example, has spent 10 years trying to get to 30% of women on boards, and they've just cracked it at, I think they're about 33%. So that's 10 years it took them to get to influence boards to get to 33%, which I find challenging. And therefore they haven't even moved to looking at cultural inclusion on a board. So I think what we need to do collectively in your industries and my industries is start to talk about these bigger social issues, because we know that they're kind of the crucible in which other inequities, unfairnesses and abuses, like how decisions are made, but through to abuse in the workplace or abuse at home, happen. So I think it's really important to see what strategies we have in place and to know that we are calling out violence through all of them. They're different strands in the big tapestry, and we need to be on top of all of them.
And just lastly on this slide, there's a call out for Our Watch. So I think just as a really easy to understand resource, if you go onto the Our Watch website, they do have an animated a video that explains gender inequality and violence, and it's a really good place to start, especially if you're wanting to engage maybe with your executive team or your leadership team. You can show that video. It takes about 3.5 minutes, and then have a conversation. And it's also has different layers and different nuances in which you can look at that. So I'd strongly recommend that people look to that. So we have got one question in the chat box, which is, at what point should you identify behaviour as potentially problematic? For example, if a person is speaking about their partner or ex-partner and using strong language, so when they're going through a separation or a custody battle, should this be seen as a sign that should be addressed? So that's a good question. Elisabeth, did you want to tackle that one?
Look, I think one way to guide our decision making is always to say, is the behaviour appropriate in the workplace anyway? So if someone, for example, is talking about their partner using language or expressing attitudes that we wouldn't tolerate if the subject was any other subject, then a way to go in, might be to say, it's understandable that, it sounds like you've got a lot going on the home front. You are sounding really angry at work. The stories you're telling at work are pretty full on, and people are a bit confronted by it. How do we support you? So I think being able to name the behaviour. I think if you start to worry that a person is either their anger is escalating, they're starting to look and sound unsafe because even their language is worrying, or they're becoming more submissive, it's an impact on the workplace that won't go well for them. So usually someone who's sounding angry, others will start to avoid them. people will start to think, well, if that's your attitude, I don't like the sound of you. So I think we need to still address that, not start to say, oh, well, this sounds like they're going through an ugly separation. We can understand that. We'll give them a bit of time to work that out. I think we need to keep looking at courageous conversations in workplaces and use it to lean in that you're sounding angrier, you're making people, a bit hesitant about you. You may not want to come across like that. You may be going through a tough time. Can we support you? Because probably talking like that in the workplace isn't going to serve you well. I think it's in their interests and ours to start to, look at that. The same if someone is late to work all the time and they tell you they're living with abuse, eventually you've got to say, look, I want to help you. We've got all of these programs and mechanisms. We want to support you. You are also in a workplace. And how can I help you succeed given that a workplace can do this much and we need to help you do the other bits. So I think if we start to say, oh, the poor thing can't do any better, we actually end up disengaging from them through good intentions. But that person may languish in our organisation because inadvertently and maybe unconsciously we've written them off. So I think, hold yourself around the task that you need to do. Our job is to make our employees strong and robust and resilient and successful, and so to say, well, what's the best thing I can offer them to be that, taking into account the bigger picture. I think that'll keep you in good stead in your role.
We just had a question around where the video can be obtained from, and it's the Our Watch website. So we can pass those details on to Jo and Sophie, yes. But Our Watch is a really good resource. They're based in Victoria, in Melbourne, and they've got a great group of researchers and practitioners in Our Watch as well.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth and Rebecca. I've noticed we have had probably one of our largest participation percentages on today's session. And I think you both have done a quite incredible job of taking what is a very complex and challenging situation and providing us with really what perceived to be quite simple but very actionable items that we can take back into our workplaces and in our work. You provided such a huge number of resources. What we will be doing is this session has been recorded. We will obviously just edit little bits of it, and that recording will be uploaded onto both the Safe Step and the Next Step website by mid to end point of next week. What we will do is we will tell everybody when that is available via our LinkedIn, and to all the registered participants, we'll send you an email to let you know so that you can tap back into this phenomenal resource. I can already see in the chat box lots of people sharing what amazing content. So I thank you absolutely from the deepest part of my heart for sharing your time, and we really, really look forward to continuing to support this really powerful message.
Thanks so much, Jo. And I just wanted to also thank the Next Step and the Safe Step for hosting this. And I think that, domestic and family violence isn't always easy to talk about, and it often lands with HR and HSE leaders. And so I think it's really important to have these conversations and to share very openly what we can do to support one another, because it's not easy. And I wish I could also have had a slide at the end that said, and here's the golden ticket about how to magically fix all of this in your workplace. It's not that simple. And I would just encourage people to keep sharing, to connect with one another on LinkedIn, and to share those experiences that work well for them and that provide good outcomes for their employees. But also, I think one of the things I'd definitely say, and probably since I've been at RA, I've learned more about this, is to make sure you care for yourself when you walk into the space of domestic and family violence, and whether you go in there intentionally or unintentionally, because we all know when an employee asks to speak to us, sometimes you don't know what's going to happen in that meeting room or on that call. So don't be ashamed of needing support yourself. If there's something that you've had to deal with an employee for the first or the fifth time, it doesn't matter. It can be really confronting. So EAP is there for HR and HSE professionals as well, not just the people we often refer to it. And so I would just strongly encourage everyone to make sure that they're looking after themselves as professionals so they can serve and not just them, but their team members, and that they can serve their organisation well, because it can be a tough and thankless job, HR and HSE. So sometimes I wonder why we do it, but there's upsides as well. But it's important to look after yourself. So thank you, Jo.
Great call out. Thank you once again. And as I say, we will make this and widely publicise the recording of this webinar, because, as I say, the feedback is coming in thick and fast of how sensational the content is. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll look forward to presenting some more. We've got one more webinar to close out 2020 before setting up a very positive and very different 2021 for us all. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Jo. Thanks, everyone.